Hi everyone, I'm John from HTN and welcome to this webinar today where we're set to discuss AI technologies with a particular focus on discussing the practicalities, implementation and adoption through to data bias, regulation and policy and lots more really. So I'm pleased to welcome a panel joining us. We have Neil Crump, the Digital Strategy Director at the Dudley Group NHS Foundation Trust, Lee Rickles, CIO and Director at Humber Teaching NHS Foundation Trust, and Beatrix Fletcher, the Senior Programme Manager for AI at Guy's and St Thomas NHS Foundation Trust. So thank you to the panel for joining us today. So just before we start, I've got a couple of housekeeping things to cover. So this session will be recorded and there will be a write-up made by the HTN team so you can read or watch it back and share it with your colleagues at a later date. And if you have any questions in the audience, please type them into the chat. So I'm keen to hear your questions or any thoughts or comments from you. If you have anything that you'd like to share, links, documents, anything really, please do so in the chat. And we'll have some time towards the end of the session for a Q&A as well. So I think a good place to start is with some wider introductions. If I could ask the panel to take us through your role, remit, perhaps how your organisation is utilising AI or planning to, and just share any examples of your organisation in relation to AI. So Beatrix, hi, could I start with you with that question, please? And welcome to the webinar.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name's Beatrix. I'm a senior PM in AI in clinical scientific computing, which is a small team that sits within medical physics at Guy's and St Thomas's. My role is twofold. I run a fellowships in clinical AI, which is focused on educating the workforce in technology and AI use at the front line. And also internally, I work with the CSC team to evaluate and deploy AI products to the trust. My background is in nursing and midwifery. I've worked in private industry and general business and marketing as well. How we use AI currently is probably similar to other organizations, mostly in sort of medical imaging is the sort of leading workforce group, but certainly not the only one. We use a lot of decision support tools in triaging and prioritizing, whether that's incidental findings of pulmonary embolisms or certain fractures on X-ray. We use some prioritizing tools in the emergency department, and then we have sort of different modalities in large language models for auditing of reports post-surgery to sort of predict potentially some elements of a intervention that may have had a certain outcome. So yeah, that's sort of like how we generally use AI. That's very brief, but happy to go into more detail later.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm keen to hear more about the fellowship, how you evaluate those technologies and methodology, and I'm sure we'll get into that. Neil, can I come to you next, please, in terms of a wider introduction and how the Dudley Group are using or planning to use AI technologies?
Thanks, John. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Digital Strategy Director at Dudley Group. I've got 25 years experience in commercial, public sector and third sectors. And the remit that I have at Dudley Group is design of the digital plan, the architecture, all the way through to cyber governance and the analytics team, and essentially doing a lot of cross-portfolio working to deliver and assure the digital plan. In terms of projects or initiatives where AI has played a role already at Dudley Group, our focus has been on stratification tools, so using our sort of informatics team to work with suppliers in terms of prioritization. So that could either be prioritization for patients based on improving information from diagnostics, so that's on the stroke pathway, through to more focus on the elective recovery and outpatient waiting lists. We also have been learning, I suppose, in a quite safe way, using natural language processing tools. So we've migrated our analytics platform to the cloud, which has given us access to these out-of-the-box tools where we're focusing on things like patient experience feedback, staff surveys, incidents, and carrying out sentiment analysis, thematic analysis, in order to sort of understand how patients are either satisfied or not with our NHS services, or to identify concerns in staff surveys or common themes in IT incidents and things like that. Another key learning point actually is around cyber. That industry seems to be a few years ahead of certain clinical areas. So we've been applying that to detection response and threat protection. And that's given us a real great understanding actually of how to use reinforcement learning in order to train the tools based on the alerts that we receive. And we can see that would be helpful clinicians in the future, because then they're going to be able to have less fatigue alert. And then finally, auto coding. So that's making sure that we can have a depth of coding for acute and planned care admissions, so we understand our activity and bring in the right income for the trust. And we've got some real sort of immediate opportunities that we're working on. So I think in line with quite a few different trusts, is around the use of ambient AI. So we want to release time to care so that we sort of enable transcription, so that we capture that conversation between the patient and the consultant, and then that sort of automatically enters into the system. And we're going to be deploying that across our same-day emergency care, and perhaps other areas such as rheumatology. And then secondly, around operational efficiency, we really want to make sure that to support outpatient digitisation and improve efficiencies for staff and access for patients, that we can actually improve experience for both of those groups of folk, as well as optimizing patient flow and staffing and bed allocation and things like that. So a lot going on, and I'll pass over to Lee.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Yes, yeah. Well, I must be honest, Beatrix and Neil, you've got some really, really good examples there, and then you come to me. So, I'm Lee Rickles. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Humber Teaching NHS Foundation Trust. I'm also the director for Interweave. We provide a shared care record and open technology for soon to be 7, if not 8 ICSs nationally. Nationally, obviously England, because England sort of forgets that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland exist most of the time, but they do, especially if you live on that border between Wales and England. There's a hell of a lot of interoperability issues between there. But we're talking about AI today, so I've got a few different hats. I have some NAFNA roles, such as around architectural design, also and the think tank of where we're going to use certain technologies. Also the reasonable adjustment flag. I head up that particular piece of work from as I say, got shared care record responsibility, and it's interesting on the shared care record, and I will touch on that when we're looking at how we're using it. We're currently linked 800 hospitals together with over 1,200 other organisations, including private sector bodies and VCSE. And we're currently working with Google and Deloitte on using large language models and Cog AI to aggregate that data together. Because at the moment, you're now in the silly situation that you just can't see the wood for the trees if you're trying to share information, because there's generally that much duplication, just the level of normalization, is it standardized, and it's just not really helping the practitioner or even the patient if they have access to it. So there's quite an interesting challenge there, because there's a number of performance and speed and standards issues. I'm part of the ICS, so we have a community of practice, which is all about the good ideas, how we can help each other. And from a trust perspective, I'd say we're emerging. I'm saying we're emerging, and I'm going to point out that we have won HSG awards for using AI for waiting list reduction. So I would say that was probably the one of the few ones we've actually progressed. But yeah, that was around neurodiversity and children's and ADHD services, where we took an 18-month waiting list down to 3 months using AI tools and changing workflow for us. It was as much about using lean effectively as it was around AI, but the AI definitely. Lean always is a good one. Get rid of waste, but bureaucracy is loved in the NHS. We like people doing stuff that adds zero value just because we can. So we've done a little bit really on clinical in that respect. So we've got that bit. We've also for quite a few years been doing friends and family. We do have practices. So sorry, I didn't explain the trust. We're a community mental health and primary care, being very heavy on friends and family, especially from the primary care. So we've got AI tech, which is always interesting how that how the analytics work against what people score and what they say. So I think what you mentioned, Neil. Yeah, it's always interesting. The scores and the words don't always match, or rarely match, shall we say. The from an organisation, really looking at where we're going to go for Copilot and sweating the Microsoft stack, just because we don't have to deal with software as a medical device or not. That issue is an interesting one. We've already got quite an embedded voice recognition software, so the issue is the investment cycle on ambient voice, but we are looking at that. What I'd say is we're emerging on the AI. It's something that the exec team are really keen on. The AI group reports directly to the exec team, really looking at opportunities for productivity and improvement and definitely quality. We have, as a trust, our productivity score, if you look at a mean of 100, we're 120. Some of that is just because our clinicians just don't record activity, the buggers. I must be honest, I have checked. I would like to say I checked, not recently, but the team have checked. We do triangulate against expenses, claims, and activity. And I tell you what, the expenses claims always has more accuracy than the activity. But again, there's still opportunities there. So I would say we're, as a trust, we're emerging. I'd probably say on the interweave side, we're definitely a lot further ahead from how do we use AI and optimize in that way. Although it is interesting, and we'll probably touch on that from the governance of the different views of suppliers when you have them in a room, and from standards and accreditation and regulation. So
Fantastic.
That's me.
Thank you, Lee. And we've covered a lot of different applications there and lots of different use cases, which obviously shows the potential here. I'm keen to talk about some of the challenges and learnings and go and talk about data and how we can avoid bias in data, and then go on to implementation and adoption and evaluation and how that can be done. And Beatrix, I'll no doubt come to you for that one. So my first question, let's talk about some challenges. So what are the barriers or challenges to introducing AI at an organization level? Neil, could I come to you first for this one, please? And what have you seen as some of those barriers?
Yeah, thanks, John. Before I go into the barriers, could I just talk about a couple of concepts that we've developed in order to help us understand those barriers in the first place? Because I think AI is quite a new area, right? And I think we all as trust needs to understand that better. So there's a couple of key things that we've been doing. One, we've been setting ourselves up as a learning lab. So, and I'll pop in the chat, because we'd love to say that we're an AI competency centre, right? However, we're not at that level. So what we're proposing is actually we go on this learning journey in order to make sure that we can go through a process. And I've just put it in the chat, which kind of like gives a summary of how we're thinking it in terms of like the problem statement. So we kind of recognize that the volume and velocity of healthcare exceeds our capacity to actually sort of deliver without AI and automation. Yeah, so that's kind of like a problem statement we've set up. And then we're saying that we're going to use, therefore, AI to automate and sort of actually put that within the workflow, because I think that's going to be one of the critical things for clinicians, that they don't have these separate AI sat outside their existing workflow. So, and there's a lot more detail on that, which I won't go into now. You can take that away and have a look, but it looks at all the types of people we're going to be collaborating with, the infrastructure that you need, and then kind of some of the outputs that we are looking for in terms of relationships, engagement, those key areas of focus, i.e. where we're planning to deploy AI, and then some success measures, because clearly we need to actually work out where we're headed and actually recording that. So we then have used the MITRE model. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. I'll just put like some of the key pillars. So it's like this maturity model that exists. It's open source, so I'll put it in the chat. You can go and look it up in Google. Anyone can access it. And we've actually then defined how we'd like to get more advanced with AI over time. So we're just setting up our new digital plan 25 to 28, and this is a key component of that. So you've got those sort of 6 pillars, and underneath they've got different dimensions, 20 or so in total. And then you actually sort of have a look over 5 key areas. With then, because of the National Health Service having this what good looks like, map that against the what good looks like framework. So for example, so that we can see how AI is going to support people, how it's going to make practice safer, how it's going to empower citizens, how it's going to improve care, etc. And that through that, we've then started understanding some of those barriers that we have. So it might be the clinical safety standards, for example, around cyber data protection as well. We've created like a skills framework, or I should say, we're in the process of developing a skills framework by looking at others and how they're doing it. So I think that's very much a work in progress. We're putting them and the barriers in terms of the modern, secure data infrastructure operating environment. So I briefly said we'd move to the cloud. We think a lot of the AI will be software as a service in future. So I think you need to make that secure and available, and making sure that we've got those metrics in place, because without metrics you're not going to be able to show how you actually crash through those barriers. So in summary, that's kind of the approach we've taken so far.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil, and thanks for sharing that, and really like the idea of a learning lab as well. Beatrix, can I come to you next, please, in terms of how are you approaching AI projects from like a regulation and policy perspective? How do you balance introducing those projects with managing risk at the same time? So I think the question is more, what are your learnings from some of your projects from a project management perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think like a lot of complex issues, the barriers and opportunities come at a very high top level and then all the way down at the weeds. I think as Lee said, from the very first point, if you don't have the data, you can't use this technology. If the data is in siloed different pots and is not structured, you cannot use this technology. So from like a very ground up level, you need to be thinking about where you're wanting to go with this, how your systems are getting in your way already, and then move towards potentially what you can build on top of it. That then can cause obviously barriers around performance, but also when you're talking about bias in AI, that's where we're getting it from. People circumvent the lack of access to their own hospital's data by going externally to data sets that are already structured and available to either open source or to buy. And often those data sets are not representative of your local population. So straight away, your performance is going to be poorer. From an organizational perspective, I think there is lots of conversation about wanting this, but there doesn't seem to be as much conversation about what is our actual appetite here for risk. How soon do we want this? What work are we willing to put in an organizational cultural shift? This is not something that a separate team can decide about and just say, hey guys, this is happening now. Everyone has to come along on the journey and change our way of thinking about the tools that we use in clinical practice. I think, again, Neil, you mentioned about this being part of a clinician's workflow, but no singular tool or product will be used for a really long time. So clinicians need to get into this headspace of, this is my problem today. What solution can I use now? In 2 weeks, couple of months, couple of years, that's no longer valid or there's a better option that then solves just this part of the workflow, but also all the parts of the workflow before or all the parts of the workflow below. So definitely with that sort of lean approach, you don't want to be automating or using artificial intelligence for a singular part and then ignoring the downstream impact, especially in sort of products that are about prioritization. We often find that the department that uses that tool, say radiology, may have some impact of like speed of how quick they do their reports, but in general they're pretty good anyway. But the impact is seen where they're now referring those patients to, and are those departments ready for their referrals to be increased by 3, 5, 10-fold. Yeah, so I guess that's a couple of different like barriers that are kind of at the weeds and a bit higher level as well. So it's always a challenge to work out which to go for first, I would say. But my biggest recommendation would be for an organization to document their appetite for the technology and how much risk they're willing to take on for that.
Excellent points. Thank you. And Lee, can I come to you next? From your perspective, from what we've discussed so far, as well, what do you think are some of the challenges and what's the supplier role in this? Keen to talk about that and hear your views on the supplier position.
Yeah. I think Neil and Beatrix have probably articulated quite well. I mean, Beatrix, I'd love to probably have a longer conversation on data bias, because there's data bias all the time. It's understanding the data bias, and even as people, we have our own biases, so we can't say bias isn't already in practice. But it's just that recognition of how accurate the bias is against, as you say, your population. So population in one part of the country is completely different if you plonk it in India, for instance, based on the health needs and socioeconomic stuff there. And just looking at the only bit I would probably add is we've talked a lot about risk appetite, and we've talked a lot about the opportunity. I think the bit I'm not sure if I've picked up, but it's definitely where we're coming from as an organisation is, where is the need? Where have we got them pressure points? Where have we got them bottlenecks? Where have we got them issues where either for financial or for clinical? Because again, so let's call it quality, because normally if you deal with the quality bit, the rest of it follows. That it's actually getting the best bang for the bucks, or mitigating risk, or it's improving experience. And they're not necessarily, and this is where I am leading on to suppliers here, John, just if you're wondering where I'm going on this one. This is when it leads into the suppliers. So let's be honest, we've got some very professional outfits out there that know their onions, understand software as a medical device or not, as the case may be, even though that's quite ambiguous. There was some good guidance that got sent out for mental health services last week. I believe it was last week. I'd actually say that's quite applicable to a lot of services, not just mental health, because it's a lot better than the general guidance on that's available. And then you have the snake oil sellers that are out there as well. So the companies that are really there, that have just taken an off-the-shelf open source AI, banged some stuff, probably done very bad learning and tweaking of the and tuning of the application, and then are now contacting operational colleagues and telling them, here's the next miracle, and it will save everything. It will make your life so much easier. We'll integrate everything you've got, all that type of stuff. So there is the issue, and this is where it comes to the regulation component. The absence of that clear understanding of what is a medical device with respect to digital technology and suppliers makes it really, really hard for organizations to understand what should be applied. Even if you're in the basic world of, have you got a clinical safety hazard log, have you got the DTAC, which includes that anyway, and is it software as a medical device or not? Now that is a sort of a grayish area, but there are extremes there. And if we keep it really simple, if the device translates all the information in a way that the practitioner does not understand what's being done to it with software as a medical device, if they can fully understand and see the pathway, We're probably not. We're probably in a supportive. And that's where I think suppliers, definitely the unscrupulous ones, get into organisations. I've had it myself, where they'll talk to an operational team, come up with all these mystical savings. In one case, it was greater than the whole budget of the department, which was brilliant. But they sort of get sucked in. It's this new brave new world, isn't it wonderful? And then they get slightly disappointed when you have to start getting a little bit of, have we checked this? Have we checked that? Have we really looked at this? What's the evidence base? Are they able to show referenceability to others? Where's the ethics? Where's all the other bits? Are they even on a framework? And if they are, is it one that you would actually recognise and of value? So I think from a supplier point of view, it does feel a bit of the Wild West. And let's be brutally honest, this is open source products in a lot of cases. It doesn't have to be a supplier. The biggest risk is probably around the clinician that's playing with ChatGPT in shadow IT and is using it for practice, not being tested or checked, but they can do that type of stuff. We did a survey just generally. It was a bit of a, I also look after the innovation hub at my trust, and we did a bit of an ask on who uses Cog AI, just generally, and how many of them, and it came up that probably about, when we explained what it was, and then, because there is that understanding, it's probably around 80%, and then how many use it for work? Probably about 60% use it on shadow, if not more. So it's already in there. The issue is using it for clinical. I think there's a subtle difference between, and then we'll let the others come in. I think there's a subtle difference between the corporate solutions, and I must, as an organisation, we are focusing more on the corporate, which, believe it or not, does give time to for practice. So a few good examples we've got is just shortlisting candidates using AI saves massive amount of clinical time, because then bloody clinicians have to read through all them bloody applications to get. And funny enough, when it's low grades, we get lots of them. When AI can speed it up. Just on supervision, automating using the MS Teams Premium Plus thing, and auto creation of supervision creates time. Again, there's other examples, but the general direction's been probably because we are a bit more risk averse on the clinical side. I think I'd like to be a fast follower than an early adopter. Early adopters is normally a very painful process, normally very expensive. We prefer to take something that's already been proven in that respect. So I think I've kept the other two colleagues hands up long enough there. John, do you want to bring them in?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, like, a lot of the sort of points that you're flagging up are the exact reason we made the fellowship in clinical AI. We want to empower clinicians with all of the knowledge that you were just talking about, so that if they are approached at a conference and sent by a private industry company saying, hey, that problem you didn't know you had, yeah, I have the solution for you, they have straight away those questions. Yeah. I think also the power of a clinician understanding this from all of these different points of view is when you talk about risk management, about bias, the clinician is best placed to know whether the outcome of a tool potentially not performing at a really, really high rate, for example, the safety impact of that. So does it determine whether someone might have an extra scan, or does it determine whether a leg is amputated? It's pretty different, right? And you can kind of come down to that, like software as a medical device. And our team has a quality management system that we've developed, and all of our products go through that regardless of whether it will go to a commercial product or not, just so that we're always thinking about those safety aspects. But I just wanted to flag that we need to put the power into the hands of the people that will be using these tools on a day-to-day basis, so that we can work together. And I think that works better for the operational teams as well. It'd be great if you were only being brought propositions that answer all those questions already, and then it's like, okay, great, how do I operationalize this for you? So I just wanted to flag that.
No, it's a really good example. So it's really good point. And I think the issue we've probably got as well, just to add to it, is, let's be honest, can you really write an AI strategy? Does AI stand still short, that briefly enough to, so you really got that how do you keep rolling with the punches? How do you keep up to date with development? So we are on that, that innovation piece. So, being far more aware is far more important. It's not as stable as other solutions or other products. If you look at where we are this year compared to last year on AI, it's a very different animal. So, really interested, as you said, about the what you've been doing with practitioners. Maybe there's something there for sharing and blueprinting, or at least picking up after the call.
Of course.
Definitely. Neil, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I think from sort of a procurement and supplier perspective, what we're looking for is to make sure that there's an explainability around those algorithms. So, and what we mean by that is it's in plain English. There are sort of diagrams that actually show how the decision making actually takes place, etc. So that then is going to give the clinicians understanding in a clinical context about how that AI is actually going to be deployed. I think the second thing is going and get the suppliers actually going and getting peer-reviewed sort of journal evidence base around their solutions. Because what we're finding is, as you implement with clinicians, quite rightly, they're going to question things. And they want that assurance, really, that they understand the algorithm, what it's doing, and how it's actually going to improve clinical practice. And they want to speak to other clinicians in other trusts as well when they're actually implementing, because they actually want to see in practice what's happened, what improvements, and actually what are some of the issues that have come out as well. So once you've done that implementation, you need a really robust process, and this is working with the supplier to make sure that actually there aren't any problems that are coming out. So when you start looking at the false positives, for example, you actually understand why you're getting those false positives. And it may be, for example, that there's a US vendor, for example, that's trained their algorithms on a different type of demographic, which means that actually those false positives are coming up because actually you've got a different set of citizens that actually may not actually apply in the same way as the algorithm was designed. So you need that sort of robust and working with the supplier actually post-implementation too.
Great. Thank you, Neil. Can we move on to evaluation? Beatrix, can I come to you in terms of how do you effectively evaluate some of these technologies? What are you doing at your organisation?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were talking, Neil. One of the struggles that we have is that we cannot accurately give you that answer of how this is performing and what its risks are until we have trialed it on our patient data sets. We can do that retrospectively, and that's what we do with all of our evaluations. We assess their feasibility, their criticality, potential impact on patient care, upstream and downstream. There's lots of assessment before we sort of go forward. We pull retrospective data and test performance, check if it's performing as the vendor says it does. But then this critical point of a prospective trial, essentially, running, implementing, deploying the product into the workflow and running it either side by side or as sort of some of the group are using it, some of the group aren't. And we have sort of between 3 to 6 months of that product being used. Then we stop and we say, did that work from a sort of quantitative point of view, but also how did staff find that? And it's that point of trying to convince the organization that this is safe enough to deploy to workstations so that we can test it is something that is tricky, because understandably, typically in traditional deployments of products, we already know all of that information before we even think about telling staff, hey, we're going to start doing this now. And so, yeah, that's what I was saying about, like, we have to change everyone's culture to sort of these types of experiments, essentially. and we have to experiment. As Lee said, you know, the first people trialing all of these things, that it is hard. It's really hard. It's expensive in cost, but it's expensive in, you know, social capital that you're using with your staff. You know, it's very hard then to deploy something and then they really like it. And you say kind of, we've come to the end of our evaluation. The vendor now would like us to pay for something. They're all used to it, but now we're going to have a gap where we're building this business case up to try and get the funding for it. And so, you know, it's just this sort of clunkiness that we're only going to get better at the more we do it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beatrix. And we've had a lot of questions come in the chat, so I'm just going to go to them. I've got one quick one for you, Neil. How are you at the Dudley Group evaluating some of those technologies? Like, for example, you mentioned using AI for clinical coding, for supporting your cybersecurity. How are you doing that sort of evaluation piece? Is there anything you'd like to add following what Beatrix said?
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of take a slight backward step, however, answer that question in the fact that we started with, or we're in the we've developed a framework and a policy that sits off that framework, and then standard operating procedures, right? So the reason why that's so important is because you actually need to make sure that, one, you're promoting and protecting the interests of patient service users, citizens, etc. However, it's around that sort of roles and responsibilities as well within an organisation. So it's making sure that the chief exec officers actually understand they got a statutory responsibility. So as part of the Health and Social Care Act, making sure that the med director actually goes and appoints a responsible person for AI. Yeah. Because you're going to have incidents that do arise, and you actually need someone who's kind of like responsible for that. At a clinical director level, when they're actually implementing, that they need to know that they're responsible for the sort of safe planning, deployment, and then that post evaluation that I talked about earlier. And then from a user perspective, you need to make sure that people are given the opportunity to actually be trained, for example, and actually that they understand within the standard operating procedure that there might actually be limitations to that AI, and actually understand, so they're actually still practicing their clinical expertise, not necessarily just solely relying on the AI. So I think that's like a really important aspect. And then going into the detail, I suppose it's around that sort of documentation, therefore, that you actually take on as part of the project. So you need evidence reports, for example, in order to get that sort of transparency and compliance. So that might be covering things like the training of the data sets. It might be things like validation processes, risk assessments. It might be compliance with regulations, for example. And I think we actually need help from the national team as well on here when we're actually doing this for particular areas. So I think if you look at one of the most successful rollouts of AI, that's been in stroke, right? Mm-hmm. So Dudley is an acute and community provider. And therefore, we've got a stroke unit, which is part of like this hub and spoke model. And back in 2019, there was only 5% of trusts using AI to support stroke. That's now gone up to 100%. Yeah. So, and I think that's a good example of how the national team can actually help us in that kind of setup. So working with the suppliers, making sure that the documentation is done correctly, that it's got the right sort of sign off and procedure. Because what we found was then that our teams were more able to easily adopt that solution, whether it be at the start of the process with the IT vetting and the information governance, through to all the way through to the actual implementation and the clinical engagement and adoption.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. And let's go to
John. Can I just come back on one thing that Neil said, if that's okay? So yep. I think Neil, I think you're absolutely right. There's something of where there is that national lead, that national direction. Create that evidence once and research information, then supports many rather than everybody doing it. And obviously that's totally, totally essential for clinical. I mean, that's what we're here for, to support patients and make sure we have a healthier population. But I really am seeing that very heavily, if I've got my CIO hat on, that everybody's currently testing Copilot. So what we've probably got is about 40 or 50 Copilot tests going on at this point in time, rather than actually, come on, NHS England, do your job, help people, do something in a bit more coordinated and focused manner. So we all do. So we all benefit from the learning and the evidence base, which, to be blunt, is probably what's the benefits and how much does it cost. That's from a corporate point of view, obviously, Neil, not necessarily the clinical. The clinical is obviously outcomes as well. But I think there is something there, and unless we actually, as organisations, get together, which in some cases does happen, Neil, and well, everybody on the call, but in other cases it just doesn't seem to happen. So there is a little bit of a challenge there, that we're not necessarily benefiting from that type of approach, especially where we've got something that it's not clear what the benefits are, it's not clear what the funding model is. It's then down to appetite, what position you're in, what's your opportunity. It's not the best way to spend the NHS pound, really. So I'm just really supportive of that, what you've said, Neil. It's just how we might get our central colleagues to maybe being a bit more focused, or at least making sure we're a bit more focused on where we invest time and effort.
I agree with sort of a blueprint approach, right?
Yeah, it would be a lot better than at the moment everybody's going to do something in the absence of a gap. I know we're not an FDP in it today, John, but I'd use the FDP as a really good example, that the federated data platform is a solution that's 5 to 6 years too late. Everybody was asked at an ICS point of view to build data lakes, platforms, all that type of stuff, and then the FDP turns up, and then we're wondering why people aren't really getting excited about a new data platform. We can't afford for NHS England to always be 5 to 6 years too late after everybody's already done it. We need them to become a slightly different organisation, which I also accept is going to be quite difficult in the current situation, where there's going to be yet another set of cuts and another set of deck chair moves. But it doesn't prevent it happening. It just means it might just be a little bit harder. But if they won't do it, then the opportunities, we have to do it ourselves, which we have done in certain areas. I know Shared Care Record, they really have got their act together, and they're just ignoring NHS England and get on with their own thing now. He says, as he chairs that group.
Right, let's get to some questions.
Sorry, John. Sorry.
I'd also like to follow on from what you said, Neil, around blueprinting and sharing information. So if anybody in the audience has anything from your organisation that you want to share in terms of documents, policies, blueprints, learnings, evaluations, drop the links into the chat. That'd be really appreciated. So the first question is, are any organisations factoring in ethics and/or sustainability criteria into the procurement of AI, given how much data around how much energy AI can consume? Who'd like to take that one first?
I'm happy to come in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beatrix.
In terms of ethics, 100%, they're part of the procurement decision. They can't not be, and they come up at different stages along the path. How deep they can physically go is kind of tricky when you're buying a product. You can say, does this work on this certain population? What sort of data did you use, et cetera, et cetera. But, an organization that is private industry has the right to say, I can only tell you to this point, otherwise I'm telling you how my product works, right? So then you get into that argument. The other aspect of that was what, sorry? Ethics and
sustainability.
Yeah, this is something that our team has talked about quite a lot. It's kind of tricky to fully quantify, and also sometimes we find it's the same case with AI. It's held to a higher level because it's a new technology, and so when you talk about how much energy will this particular algorithm use in compute power, for example, we can give you that, but there's not a very good understanding of how that compares to anything else in the organization, in the hospital. So I think without, it can't be, just one work stream that does that work. It has to be a group effort so that we can be discussing where in the organization this is falling and how to compare that to overall benefit, etc. So yeah, both kind of tricky ones, but very, very much part of the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Neil, can I come to you?
Yeah, I mean, the ethics is absolutely embedded in our overall framework, and then the policies, etc. So really, really important part. And I would say we're not doing that at a trust level, just for everyone to kind of understand. We're doing that at an ICS level. So we're working with the other. So Dudley Group is part of the Black Country. Yeah, there are 4 acute and community providers. There's also a mental health provider, as well as the the ICB team. So we're working together in order to go faster, really, and to make sure that we're not all developing our own framework and policy and ethics, etc. And we've actually leaned on national guidance as well as part of that. So it's not like we've started from scratch. We've just reviewed and then taken from national where it makes sense. So I think that's on the ethics side. I think on the sustainability, we've not really, although we've got a clear green plan and digital's absolutely embedded in that, we've not actually considered AI yet. So that's an area for us still to explore. I think it's pretty new, but if you look at DeepSeek, for example, one of the things that really interested me around DeepSeek was that it's open source, and it means that you could actually run that infrastructure yourself. Yeah. So, and the amount of compute power was vastly reduced as well in comparison to some of these other ways of doing AI. So if that gives us an example of perhaps of where the industry might be heading, I think that will help us all in terms of thinking from a sustainability perspective.
Excellent. Thank you, Neil. Lee, you've raised your hand.
Just on. Yeah, thanks, John. So sustainability is interesting because what we're really talking about is cloud computing, which realistically, if we go back a few years, it was seen as the green option. Cloud, allegedly, there was never really an evidence base that came up. It was one of those things. Now, as an organisation that's predominantly on the cloud, I've got some domain controllers on premise. That's about it. The challenge isn't necessarily, and we're definitely going to see it in AI in the cloud, isn't necessarily replicating what you have from a usability. As soon as you're in the cloud, you can really, especially on platform as a service or software, you can really ramp up and use far more capacity and capability far faster than you can with on-premise. So I'll be honest, we've been through more being on the cloud because we can do stuff faster, including EPR, the Databricks, all that type of stuff, and other tooling, irrespective of the AI, because people want things faster, quicker, whatever, which does have a negative effect. It's not the green solution. So I can see us coming to a really big problem, and it's in the media as well that what is it? We're going to run out of water or something like that if because we're going to have to cool too much of our cloud computing capability, that we're going to struggle with water supply, which I kind of understand in England because obviously we're a very dry country, very hot, very Mediterranean like, aren't we? He says, looking out at the rain in the window. So I think I think that's going to be a difficult one to square off, John. The green agenda against cloud computing, they just do not match realistically. Even the best will in the world, as soon as you put an AI in, and I see where you're coming from, Neil, but that's now, there'll be the next one that comes, and we're going to end up burning through more and more, and it won't necessarily have the constraints we've had with either on premise or how old systems use data. So it's not looking good from the green agenda perspective.
Right. We've had an interesting question about physical records. So the question is, with many hospitals still using physical records, how are you starting to use AI? Well, how are you starting to use AI with those records when they're digitized? And I guess that unstructured content, half of that record might be unstructured. What's the use of AI as part of records management? Lee, do you want to take that one?
So well, I'm going to start with it. Yeah, it does have an impact. If you've got poor data, don't expect the AI to solve all your problems. It might help, but poor data, paper records with poor handwriting that you can't convert into structured text that then can't be converted into something coded. Yeah, it's problematic. And again, because we're only talking now, you're realistically not going to go back the last 20 years and fully digitize a person's whole health record to help on some of the tools we want. But AI isn't just on that side of it. We use AI. We have a AI as a medical device for our ADHD children, but it monitors them, it watches them, and then it looks at how their actions, how they act, and then that determines diagnosis or potential diagnosis and then follow on plans. So not everything with AI is always around the data on the record, albeit you need to do learning from similar tools. I don't know. Does anyone know about the story about the ruler and Leeds radiology? Okay, here's a really good example of an AI. So Leeds have done loads of really good stuff on radiology. They have. I'm really impressed with them. So what they used to do on the images, when it was a positive cancer, they put a ruler on that image. When it was a negative, so when there was a clear, there was no ruler. The AI started to learn that if there was a ruler there must be something wrong with the image. So if there was never a ruler on the image, it was fine. And that was part of the learning data set for the AI itself. So I'm just using that as another example of that's an absence of additional data. The absence of other data also means you'll have poor decision making. It's AI, but it's people as well. So, World War II, all the bombers that come back when they started looking at when there was all had big holes in them, they started to reinforce the materials around where the big holes were. And then somebody pointed out, actually, what about where the holes wasn't? Because they're the ones that aren't returning. Maybe that's where the problem is, which was absolutely right, around cockpit area, back end of. Sorry, I'm an aviation guy as well. So yeah, bad data, you're going to struggle. So I think it's a real challenge. That doesn't mean there isn't value. I think that's understanding what value it can give and how it can assist and where you might need to get and what the type of data is. So it might have an impact, it might not. But I'm going to let my other two colleagues come in because I'm sure they're far better at that answer than me, even though I've waffled on for a few minutes.
Beatrix, do you want to go next in terms of your organisation and records management?
I probably would echo a lot of what Leah said. It is a difficult one to gather, not only because you don't have that that moment in time recorded, but any sort of AI that you take forward can't extrapolate the different things that were happening at that same moment in time. Also, we find that a lot of form filling is done in a way to just get to the next stage. So I wouldn't say necessarily that electronic records are always that much better. You find, that you have a whole form that just has dots in all of the in the entry points just to get to the next stage. But I think in general, we shouldn't be moving completely away from a patient-owned record. I'm a big advocate of a patient-owned record, and in that case, we just need a digital version of that rather than digitizing someone's physical record into our system. That's still not, that collaboration that we want to get. That's still not achieving empowerment for patients to feel in control of their own data and their care. So yeah, I don't think we should get away from patient records, but yeah, physical ones are tricky. But there's always going to be cases where we have them, and until maternity is a perfect example, women can go into labour while they're visiting their family in a different part of the UK, and they need to have that data with them right away. And maybe we tackle that through the electronic patient-owned record. Maybe we tackle that through more interoperability between systems and open communication between organisations. It's sort of a bigger, almost like philosophical question.
Fantastic. Neil, have you anything you'd like to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it just makes me think of how important data quality is to AI. Yeah, that's the first thing. I think secondly, we've got a lot of historical problems, in terms of the whole sort of physical record. Some of those problems may not be solved, although perhaps AI with the optical character recognition might be really helpful if people haven't already digitized those processes. And I think it also links to research, doesn't it? Because why would you go back and amend and digitize all of that sort of paper record? Probably because you're starting to lean towards research. You're starting to think of genetics and things like that, and to what Beatrix talked about in terms of getting that record into the hands of patients, because that will likely increase the quality of the data over time as well.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is, what is the approach to digital clinical safety cases for AI products in the trust? Do you want to take that one first, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very clear clinical safety process. We've got a clinical safety officer, as you'd expect. We do that as a process which starts all the way at the beginning, so from procurement, really getting involved in the IT vetting, through to then going through the implementation. So it's about making sure that we understand all the hazards and the harm that could be caused, coming up with the mitigating actions that we'll take in order to make sure that that doesn't take place, through to, as I talked about earlier, the sort of post-evaluation aspect once you've deployed AI, because there will be issues that will arise over time. So you can't. It's not a one done and then it's sorted. It is about actually, therefore, starting to create a register of your AI assets, as it were, and then having a methodical approach to actually going and reviewing all of those assets over time. And that's why in this day and age, you can't operate without a clinical safety officer and the huge amount of training that those individuals go through. We're not just doing that at a trust level, as I said, we're also doing that at an ICS level, working with all the providers, because naturally you're going to get different skill sets as well within the clinical safety officer. And it's rather than just having this sort of single point of failure, that clinical safety officer also needs to actually educate other users within the organization as well, so that you're able to go at pace really across a wide variety of different technologies.
Fantastic, thank you, Neil. Beatrix, is there anything that you would like to add to that question?
We have just in terms of sort of practicality, we have started the process of having our own like service queue within the IT service portal, so that systems going down, systems errors, clinical safety incidences related to AI products that our team is responsible for come directly to us. And basically we have how the product works and all the safety documentation, et cetera, on the page. So, and if IT is called, they can search by name or asset or whatever, and it immediately crops up with a bunch of information that they can see to sort of do immediate actions, but also who to contact. And I think that is something that is an interesting point around this sort of organizational restructuring. I think at the moment where our team is best placed to sort of respond to those, but maybe they should be landing in clinical engineering, maybe they should be landing in IT. It's sort of dependent. But just having some sort of record and helping your colleagues who normally receive those types of alerts, I think is a good place to start.
Fantastic. Thank you. And it's just turned 11 o'clock. So I'll have to close the session here. Thank you to the panel for coming and sharing your learnings and everything that you've shared today. We'll be doing a write-up. The recording's available, and that'll be available probably tomorrow. So we'll share that. And thank you to everyone in the audience. Apologies if we've not got to your questions. We will go through them again. If you have any questions outside this meeting, email myself, john@htn.co.uk, and I can help answer some of those. I hope you found it useful in the audience, and thanks again to the panel. A fantastic session, and we appreciate you joining us today. So thanks everybody, and have a nice day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks all.
See you.
See you all later.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye.